At 34 years old, Eleanor Brooks stood with nowhere left to belong after the Union Valley Land Company seized the boarding house where she had lived and worked for 12 faithful years, claiming unpaid debts left behind by its deceased owner. And with only $5 folded inside the worn leather purse hanging from her shoulder, she spent every cent buying an abandoned telegraph office at a forgotten county auction in the frontier town of Silver Crossing, a decision so hopeless that even the auctioneer pitied her while the handful of spectators quietly laughed, never imagining that beneath the warped pine floorboards rested the missing town charter that generations had searched for in vain, a single forgotten document capable of restoring stolen rights, protecting honest families from powerful land speculators, and changing the future of an entire community before another piece of its history vanished forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Brooks. If you're watching from a place that feels overlooked or forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because sometimes the quietest places carry the greatest stories. Eleanor Brooks had entered the world during the final years of the Great Westward Expansion, when railroad whistles still sounded like promises, and every new settlement believed tomorrow would surely be kinder than yesterday. Her father, Samuel Brooks, served as the telegraph operator in the tiny frontier settlement of Red Willow, a place where a single clicking telegraph key often carried more hope than an entire wagon train. To Eleanor, the telegraph office never seemed like a workplace. It felt alive. Every sharp metallic click echoed across the room, like another heartbeat connecting distant strangers, separated by mountains, rivers, and endless miles of prairie. Long before she learned to read storybooks, she learned to recognize the rhythm of messages arriving over the wire. Her father smiled whenever she guessed whether the clicks carried good news or sad news. "Listen carefully," he often told her while adjusting the brass sounder. "People think wires carry words. They don't. They carry trust. Every message reaches someone who is waiting." Those simple lessons settled deep inside Eleanor's heart. While other children chased each other through dusty streets or fished along quiet creeks, she spent long afternoons sitting beside Samuel's desk, watching him translate endless streams of dots and dashes into letters, sentences, and lives forever changed. A telegram announcing a child's birth often arrived with joyful urgency. News of successful harvests traveled proudly across county lines. Requests for doctors crossed the wire with desperate speed. Sometimes messages carried grief, sometimes they carried celebration. Yet Samuel treated every single telegram with exactly the same careful respect. "The person waiting at the other end," he reminded Eleanor, "never knows how much we care. They only know whether we were faithful." Her mother, Ruth Brooks, possessed equally gentle wisdom. She taught music inside the little church whenever enough children gathered for lessons, believing every town deserved songs just as much as it deserved schools. Their modest home stood only a short walk from the telegraph office, surrounded by wildflowers each spring and sheltered beneath enormous cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered constantly whenever prairie winds drifted through the valley. Evenings often ended with Ruth playing old hymns on a weathered upright piano, while Samuel quietly repaired telegraph equipment beneath the warm glow of an oil lamp. Eleanor sat nearby mending clothing, reading borrowed books, or simply listening. Looking back years later, she would remember those evenings not because extraordinary things happened, but because ordinary peace became the foundation upon which her entire life would eventually stand. Samuel believed every machine deserved proper care, no matter how old it became. Broken switches were polished rather than discarded. Worn wires were carefully spliced instead of replaced unnecessarily. Telegraph keys dating back decades remained in daily service because someone had taken the time to preserve them. Eleanor noticed that habit long before she understood its meaning. Her father rarely threw anything away unless it truly could no longer serve another purpose. "Most people confuse old with useless," he would say, while restoring another brass relay to perfect working order. "Time doesn't steal value. Neglect does." Those words shaped Eleanor just as deeply as the steady rhythm of the telegraph itself. Whenever storms damaged neighboring farms, Samuel volunteered to repair broken fence lines before fixing his own. When travelers arrived after dark seeking shelter, Ruth somehow found another place at the supper table, regardless of how little food remained in the pantry. Neither parent spoke often about kindness. They simply practiced it so consistently that Eleanor grew believing generosity belonged among life's ordinary duties, no different from sweeping floors or drawing water from the well. The years passed gently. Every spring painted red willow with bright fields of wild lupines and prairie grass stretching endlessly beneath wide blue skies. Summers filled the telegraph office with weary travelers seeking news from distant relatives. Autumn brought harvest festivals where neighbors gathered beneath lanterns strung across the town square, sharing stories until long after sunset. Winter wrapped everything beneath quiet blankets of snow, while Samuel remained faithfully beside the telegraph key, ensuring no urgent message ever went unanswered simply because weather had turned harsh. Eleanor loved every season, but she loved the telegraph office most of all. The polished oak counter, the brass instruments reflecting warm lamplight, the orderly shelves filled with ledgers and message books, the comforting rhythm of Morse code echoing through the room, all of it represented stability in a world constantly changing beyond the horizon. She often imagined that as long as those wires continued singing across the prairie, no one in Red Willow would ever truly be alone. Samuel sometimes caught her smiling at the telegraph sounder without realizing it. "One day," he told her quietly, "machines will become newer, towns will become bigger, people will chase faster ways of living. Promise me you'll remember something." Eleanor looked up from the message forms she had been carefully arranging. "What is it?" He rested one weathered hand upon the polished telegraph desk. "The most important things are almost never the loudest things. They wait patiently until someone cares enough to notice them." Eleanor nodded, though she could not yet know those words would someday lead her across hundreds of lonely miles to a forgotten telegraph office, where an entire town's future waited silently beneath worn wooden floorboards. As Eleanor grew older, nearly everyone in Red Willow began relying upon her almost as naturally as they relied upon her father. She possessed a remarkable calmness that never seemed hurried, even when the telegraph office filled with anxious faces waiting for important news. If Samuel stepped away to repair a damaged line or assist the station master at the nearby depot, Eleanor quietly assumed responsibility without complaint. She carefully copied incoming telegrams into thick leather ledgers, delivered urgent messages across town on foot, and greeted every traveler with the same gentle courtesy her parents had taught her since childhood. Before long, visiting railroad conductors began asking for Miss Brooks by name, knowing their correspondence would always be handled with accuracy and kindness. It pleased Samuel immensely, though he rarely expressed pride through grand speeches. Instead, he simply handed Eleanor greater responsibility each passing year, trusting her judgment completely. A person's character, he often reminded her while sorting telegram forms into neat stacks, is measured by what they do when no one is watching. Eleanor never forgot those words. They became the quiet rule guiding every decision she would make throughout her life. Ruth Brooks watched her daughter mature with equal admiration. During long evenings after the office closed, mother and daughter often sat together on the front porch overlooking the broad prairie, while the last colors of sunset melted into soft shades of amber and violet. Ruth spoke less about success than about purpose. "Most people spend their lives trying to become important," she said one peaceful evening, while mending an old quilt. "Very few spend their lives trying to become dependable. Yet when trouble comes, people never search for the important person first. They search for the dependable one." Eleanor smiled gently. "I'd rather be dependable." Ruth nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then you'll never truly be poor." Those conversations became treasures she carried long after both voices had fallen silent. As the years passed, the frontier itself began changing. The railroad expanded farther west, bringing larger towns, faster communication, and businessmen eager to purchase land surrounding every promising settlement. Telegraph technology improved with remarkable speed. New stations opened closer together. Older offices, serving small communities, gradually lost importance. Some closed entirely. Others remained open only because devoted operators refused to abandon them. Samuel noticed these changes with thoughtful acceptance, rather than bitterness. "Progress isn't the enemy," he told Eleanor, while replacing worn relay springs inside an aging sounder. "Forgetting why something mattered, that's the real danger." Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. Newer machines might carry messages more quickly, but they could never replace honesty, patience, or compassion. Those qualities belong to people rather than technology. Then one unusually harsh winter altered everything. Weeks of relentless snowstorms damaged telegraph lines throughout the region. Samuel spent exhausting days riding between isolated stations, repairing broken poles and frozen wires, despite worsening pain in his chest that he carefully hid from both Ruth and Eleanor. One bitter February evening, he returned home long after darkness had settled across the valley, exhausted beyond anything Eleanor had ever witnessed. The next morning, he could barely stand. The town doctor quietly admitted what Samuel already suspected. Years of difficult labor and exposure to unforgiving weather had steadily weakened his heart. He advised complete rest. Samuel smiled politely, fully aware that frontier towns rarely paused because one good man needed time to recover. Eleanor immediately assumed nearly every responsibility inside the telegraph office. She rose before dawn to inspect the lines entering town, copied messages throughout the day, delivered telegrams until sunset, then returned home to care for both parents long after the lamps had been extinguished elsewhere. She never complained. Red Willow continued functioning because she quietly refused to allow it to fail. The townspeople noticed, so did Samuel. One evening, while watching Eleanor carefully repair a stubborn telegraph relay exactly as he once had, he spoke so softly she almost failed to hear him. "You've become everything this office was ever meant to teach." Eleanor looked up from her work. "I only followed your example." Samuel smiled warmly. "No, you improved upon it." Those words became one of the last gifts he ever offered his daughter. Early the following spring, Samuel Brooks passed peacefully inside the little house beside the telegraph office, while morning sunlight filtered gently through lace curtains Ruth had sewn years earlier. Nearly the entire town gathered for his funeral. Railroad workers, ranchers, merchants, school teachers, and travelers who happened to be passing through all stood together beneath the wide prairie sky, honoring the quiet man whose steady hands had connected countless lives through simple faithfulness. Eleanor accepted every handshake and every word of sympathy with quiet grace, though a silence settled deep within her that no conversation could entirely reach. Ruth continued living with quiet courage after her husband's passing, but loneliness gradually dimmed the bright spirit that had once filled every room with music. She still taught children whenever enough gathered for lessons. She still baked bread for neighbors facing difficult times. Yet each evening she paused beside the now quiet telegraph office before returning home, almost expecting to hear the familiar rhythm of Morse code drifting once more through the open window. Eleanor remained beside her, determined that neither grief nor changing times would erase the values her parents had spent a lifetime planting. She believed those lessons would always be enough. She could not yet imagine that within only a few short years, forces far beyond her control would take away the little home she cherished, scatter the peaceful life she had carefully built, and lead her toward a forgotten telegraph office in Silver Crossing, where the greatest message she would ever receive had been waiting silently beneath the floor for decades. After Samuel Brooks passed away, Eleanor and her mother continued operating the little telegraph office with the same quiet devotion that had always defined their family. The railroad company offered to send a replacement operator from a larger town, but nearly everyone in Red Willow objected. The people trusted Eleanor. They had watched her grow from a curious little girl, fascinated by the clicking telegraph key, into a capable young woman whose calm voice and steady hands reassured frightened families whenever important messages arrived. For several years, life settled into a gentle rhythm once more. Eleanor managed the telegraph office from sunrise until late evening, while Ruth continued teaching music and sewing for neighbors who could not afford new clothing. Though money remained scarce, their modest home was rich with purpose, and purpose, as Samuel had always said, often carried people farther than comfort ever could. Yet beyond the peaceful prairie, larger changes were gathering strength. Railroad companies merged into powerful corporations. Telegraph lines became centralized beneath distant offices, where efficiency mattered more than familiarity. Investors who had never walked the dusty streets of Red Willow began deciding which stations deserved to remain open and which would quietly disappear from company ledgers. One autumn afternoon, an unfamiliar gentleman wearing an expensive black overcoat arrived carrying official documents stamped with the seal of the Western Continental Telegraph Company. His name was Horace Kendall, a regional superintendent whose polished boots seemed strangely out of place upon Red Willow's weathered boardwalks. He greeted Eleanor courteously enough before placing several folded papers upon the telegraph counter. "Miss Brooks," he said in a carefully practiced voice, "our directors have completed a review of this district." Eleanor immediately sensed what the documents contained. "They're closing the office." Kendall lowered his eyes briefly. "The company has determined that operations will be transferred to the larger station in Millhaven beginning next month." Eleanor looked around the little office that had shaped nearly every memory of her life. The brass telegraph key polished by her father's hands. The shelves lined with message ledgers stretching back decades. The broad oak counter where neighbors had celebrated births, mourned losses, and received news that forever altered their lives. Everything suddenly seemed painfully fragile. "What will happen to the people here?" she asked quietly. Kendall hesitated before answering. "Rail deliveries will carry correspondence twice each week." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Some messages cannot wait 2 days." He offered no reply, because none existed. Before leaving, Kendall removed one final document from his leather case. "The company appreciates your years of service." Inside rested a modest severance payment, barely sufficient to cover several months of ordinary living expenses. Eleanor accepted it politely, though no amount of money could replace the life quietly slipping away before her eyes. The final day of operation arrived beneath clear autumn skies. Nearly the entire town visited the office before sunset. Farmers brought jars of preserves. School children carried handwritten thank you notes. Elderly couples stopped simply to shake Eleanor's hand one final time. Even travelers passing through paused after hearing the station would soon close forever. As evening settled across Red Willow, Eleanor transmitted the final official telegram ever sent from the little office. The clicking key echoed through the empty room before falling silent. She rested her fingers gently upon the polished brass one last time. The silence that followed seemed almost impossible. For the first time since childhood, the office no longer possessed a heartbeat. Ruth stood quietly beside her daughter. Neither woman spoke for several long moments. Finally, Ruth smiled gently, despite tears gathering within her eyes. "Buildings become quiet," she whispered. "But faithful work never truly ends." Eleanor nodded, locking the front door for the last time. They believed another chapter of life would soon begin. Instead, greater hardship waited just beyond the horizon. Without the telegraph office, employment in Red Willow became increasingly difficult. Eleanor accepted bookkeeping work for local merchants, repaired clothing during evenings, and occasionally taught reading classes for younger children alongside her mother. Together, they survived modestly but comfortably enough until another unexpected blow arrived. Ruth fell ill during an unusually severe winter. The nearest physician traveled nearly 2 days through heavy snow before reaching Red Willow. Though he did everything within his limited ability, Ruth's strength slowly faded over the following months. One peaceful spring morning, with birds singing softly beyond the open window, she slipped away as quietly as Samuel had years before. Before closing her eyes for the last time, she gently squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Wherever life carries you," she whispered, "leave every place kinder than you found it." Those became the final words Eleanor ever heard from her mother. Alone for the first time in her life, Eleanor sold the little family home because she could no longer maintain it without steady employment. Carrying only her parents' Bible, Samuel's favorite brass telegraph key, several family photographs, and a single leather suitcase, she traveled east searching for honest work. Eventually she found employment at the Willow House boarding home in Silver Crossing, a growing frontier town built beside an expanding railroad junction. Mrs. Abigail Foster, the elderly widow who owned the boarding house, welcomed Eleanor warmly. "I cannot offer riches," she admitted during the interview, "but I can promise useful work and decent people." Eleanor smiled. Useful work has always been enough. For 12 peaceful years, Willow House became her second home. She managed accounts, greeted travelers, prepared meals, repaired furniture, balanced household expenses, and quietly solved countless small problems before anyone else noticed they existed. Mrs. Foster often joked that Eleanor could hold an entire household together with little more than kindness and determination. The boarders agreed. They trusted her completely. Time passed gently. Silver Crossing prospered. New businesses appeared along Main Street. Railroad whistles echoed daily across the valley. Eleanor gradually believed she had finally found another place where life might remain peaceful. Then, without warning, Mrs. Foster passed away during her sleep. She had no surviving children. Within weeks, distant creditors arrived, claiming substantial debts secured against the boarding house itself. The newly formed Union Valley Land Company immediately purchased those debts and demanded full repayment. Eleanor searched desperately through every ledger, hoping to discover an error, but the figures remained painfully clear. The property would be seized. She pleaded for additional time, offering years of future labor in exchange for preserving the home Mrs. Foster had loved. The company's representatives refused every proposal. "Business cannot operate on sentiment," their attorney remarked coldly. On a grey morning beneath steady spring rain, Eleanor carried her single leather suitcase through the front door of Willow House for the final time. Behind her, strangers began inventorying furniture as though measuring memories by the room. She possessed only $5, a few treasured belongings, and nowhere left to call home. Standing alone upon the muddy street, she noticed an old auction notice fluttering against a nearby fence. Among the listed properties stood one forgotten entry, almost overlooked by everyone else. Abandoned telegraph office, Silver Crossing East District. Opening bid, $5. Eleanor quietly folded the notice and slipped it into her coat pocket. Something deep within her stirred, as though a voice she had not heard in many years had begun gently calling her home once again. The auction took place the following Saturday beneath a cloudless spring sky in the open yard behind the Silver Crossing courthouse. By the time Eleanor arrived, nearly every worthwhile property had already attracted eager buyers. Fine wagons stood in neat rows awaiting bids. Well-kept farming equipment changed hands quickly. Furniture from prosperous estates disappeared almost as soon as the auctioneer called each lot. Merchants chatted confidently while ranchers compared prices, and businessmen quietly discussed future investments. Eleanor remained near the back of the gathering, her worn leather purse resting gently in both hands. Inside lay $5 silver, every cent she possessed in the world. She knew spending them would leave her with nothing, yet keeping them offered no future either. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd gradually thinned. The most valuable items had already been sold. Only neglected properties remained listed upon the auction ledger. The auctioneer, Benjamin Carter, removed his spectacles and glanced down at the remaining pages with visible reluctance. "Next item," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "The abandoned East District Telegraph Office, located beside Cottonwood Crossing Road. Former property of Western Continental Telegraph Company. Building sold strictly as is, no guarantees regarding condition." Several men glanced toward one another before quietly returning their attention elsewhere. One rancher chuckled. "That old place should have blown over years ago." Another shook his head. "Nothing inside but broken wires and rats." Benjamin waited patiently. Opening bid, $5. Silence answered him. A light breeze stirred the auction notices, nailed to a nearby fence. Somewhere beyond the courthouse, a freight train sounded its whistle, as though filling the awkward pause. Benjamin tried again. $5. Still no reply. Eleanor looked around the nearly empty yard. Not one person raised a hand. The abandoned telegraph office had become invisible, forgotten. She remembered standing beside her father years earlier, inside the little station at Red Willow, listening to him gently polish worn brass instruments, rather than replacing them. Most people confuse old with useless. Time doesn't steal value, neglect does. Those words returned with surprising clarity. Slowly, Eleanor lifted her hand. $5. Several nearby merchants turned to look at her. One elderly farmer frowned in quiet confusion. Benjamin blinked once before nodding. $5 from the lady. He paused hopefully. "Do I hear 6? Silence. A few scattered laughs drifted through the remaining crowd. "She's buying a pile of rotten boards," someone muttered. "Must not know what she's getting." Another man shrugged. "Poor thing probably thinks there's treasure hiding in there." Benjamin waited another moment before raising the wooden gavel. Going once, the breeze carried dust across the yard. Going twice, no one spoke. Sold, $5. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed briefly across the nearly deserted auction grounds. Eleanor stepped quietly toward the clerk's table and carefully counted out every silver dollar she owned. The clerk slid a folded property deed across the counter, together with a heavy iron key coated in years of rust. "Congratulations," he said kindly, though sympathy lingered beneath his words. "I suppose you're the owner now." Eleanor smiled softly. "Thank you." Carrying the deed, the key, and her small suitcase, she began walking east beyond the center of town. Silver Crossing gradually disappeared behind her as storefronts gave way to older neighborhoods, long forgotten after the railroad expanded westward. The road narrowed beneath towering cottonwood trees, whose branches cast dancing shadows across the dusty path. After nearly half an hour, she reached a gentle rise overlooking a quiet meadow where the abandoned telegraph office still stood. The building appeared smaller than she had imagined, yet somehow more dignified. Constructed almost entirely of weathered pine, with a steep cedar roof and broad front porch, it leaned slightly toward one side after years of neglect. Several window panes had cracked beneath winter storms. Tall grass reached nearly to the porch steps. Wild climbing vines wrapped themselves around the old telegraph poles, standing silently beside the structure, while rusted wire still stretched faintly toward the distant horizon, like forgotten threads, connecting a world that had long since moved on. Eleanor stopped several yards away. Instead of sadness, she felt something remarkably familiar. The building reminded her of the little office where her father had spent his life. Different in appearance, perhaps, yet carrying the same quiet loneliness, known only by places that had once served countless people before slowly being abandoned by time. She whispered almost without thinking, "You've been waiting a long while." The afternoon breeze answered softly through the cottonwood leaves. Climbing the worn porch steps, Eleanor inserted the old iron key into the front lock. At first, it refused to turn. Years of dust and rust held the mechanism stubbornly in place. She gently worked the key back and forth until, with one deep metallic click, the ancient lock finally surrendered. The heavy wooden door creaked slowly inward. Cool air drifted out, carrying the unmistakable scent of aged timber, machine oil, old paper, dust, and countless forgotten seasons. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, filling the room with golden shafts that illuminated thousands of tiny dust particles, floating lazily through the stillness. Eleanor stepped inside. For several long moments, she simply stood without moving. The telegraph counter remained exactly where generations of operators had once greeted travelers. Behind it rested a weathered oak desk, still supporting the skeletal remains of an old brass telegraph sounder covered in dust. Shelves lined one wall, most standing empty except for scattered ledgers, cracked porcelain insulators, and abandoned message forms yellowed by time. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner beside neatly stacked firewood that had somehow remained untouched for years. It felt less like entering an abandoned building than interrupting a conversation paused decades earlier. She slowly walked toward the telegraph desk. Brushing away years of accumulated dust, she uncovered the brass key beneath. Tarnished though it had become, the instrument remained beautifully crafted. Almost instinctively, she rested her fingertips upon it, exactly as her father once had. A flood of childhood memories returned with astonishing force. The rhythm of Morse code, Samuel's patient smile, Ruth's evening songs drifting through open windows. Tears quietly gathered within her eyes, though they carried comfort more than sorrow. "I'm home," she whispered. The building answered only with peaceful silence. She spent the remainder of the afternoon opening windows, sweeping away years of dust, and carefully sorting whatever remained inside. Most drawers held nothing except broken pencils, rusted tools, and faded telegram blanks. Yet everything had been left strangely undisturbed, as though the last operator expected to return after only a brief absence. As sunset painted warm amber light across the wooden floor, Eleanor noticed something unusual near the center of the main room. One section of the wide pine floorboards appeared slightly newer than those surrounding it. The grain matched almost perfectly, yet the color differed just enough to catch the attention of someone accustomed to repairing old wood. Kneeling carefully, she brushed away another layer of dust. Tiny scrape marks surrounded several iron nails securing those particular boards. Someone had lifted them before, then replaced them with extraordinary care. Eleanor rested one hand gently upon the smooth pine surface. Her heartbeat quickened ever so slightly. After years spent beside her father restoring worn equipment, she had learned one lesson above all others. Careful repairs almost always meant something worth protecting lay nearby. Reaching for the small pry bar she had discovered earlier, inside an old supply cabinet, she quietly wondered what forgotten story had remained hidden beneath the telegraph office floor long after everyone else had stopped believing the old building still possessed anything worth finding. Eleanor did not lift the floorboards immediately. Instead, she sat quietly beside them until the last golden light faded from the windows and the abandoned telegraph office settled into the peaceful silence known only by old buildings after sunset. Her father had taught her that hurried hands often damaged what patient hands could preserve forever. If someone had carefully hidden something beneath these boards many years ago, then whoever placed it there had almost certainly intended it to survive. That thought alone deserved respect. She lit a small oil lamp she had found upon one of the dusty shelves, cleaned its cloudy chimney, and placed it carefully upon the telegraph desk. Warm amber light slowly filled the room, softening every shadow cast across the weathered pine walls. Outside, spring crickets began singing beneath the cottonwood trees, while a distant freight whistle echoed faintly across the valley. For the first time in many months, Eleanor felt neither homeless nor afraid. The little telegraph office, though forgotten by everyone else, somehow offered the quiet comfort of familiar company. Early the following morning, she began her work. She swept every remaining corner of the office, repaired loose window shutters, removed broken furniture that could no longer be saved, and carefully stacked every useful tool she discovered inside an old supply cabinet. The more she worked, the more convinced she became that the final telegraph operator had not abandoned the building in haste. Everything had been left neatly arranged. Ink bottles remained corked. Message ledgers rested squarely upon shelves. Spare wire had been rolled carefully into coils instead of tossed aside. Even the brass telegraph key had been covered with a folded cloth before dust slowly buried it through the passing years. Someone had expected to return, yet no one ever had. Shortly before noon, footsteps sounded upon the front porch. Eleanor looked up to find an elderly gentleman standing politely outside the open doorway. His neatly trimmed white beard framed a weathered face warmed by kind blue eyes. He removed his broad felt hat before speaking. "Morning, miss. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Eleanor smiled. "Not at all. Name's Thomas Mercer." He extended a rough but steady hand. Used to deliver mail around these parts before the railroad changed everything. Eleanor welcomed him inside. Thomas slowly looked around the old office with quiet admiration. "Never thought I'd see this place breathing again." "You knew it?" Eleanor asked. He chuckled softly. "Knew every board in it." His gaze drifted toward the old telegraph desk. "Used to stop here nearly every morning delivering mail sacks. Finest operator this town ever had worked right there." "Who was that?" "Nathaniel Granger." Thomas smiled thoughtfully. "Quiet fellow, never married. Lived almost entirely for this office." Eleanor listened carefully. What happened to him? The old mail carrier's smile slowly faded. "That's the strange part." He removed his hat completely, turning it slowly between his hands. One morning, the office simply never opened. Eleanor frowned. "He disappeared." Thomas nodded. "Without warning." "Did anyone search for him?" "For weeks." Thomas looked toward the windows as though watching memories pass beyond them. The sheriff searched nearby ranches. Railroad men walked the tracks for miles. Riders checked every neighboring settlement. He shook his head gently. Nathaniel Granger simply vanished. Eleanor felt an unexpected chill despite the warm spring air filling the room. Was anything missing? Thomas considered the question carefully. Not that anyone ever discovered. He walked toward the telegraph counter and rested one weathered hand upon its polished edge. That's what made it so peculiar. His coat remained hanging behind the door. His coffee cup still sat on the stove. Payroll money stayed locked inside the safe untouched. He looked back toward Eleanor. It was as though he stepped outside for a minute and never returned. They spent another hour talking while Eleanor continued cleaning. Thomas pointed out where message runners once waited, where railroad dispatchers had gathered during winter storms, and where local children often stood, hoping to hear exciting news arriving over the telegraph wires. Before leaving, he paused beside the section of floor Eleanor had noticed the previous evening. "Funny thing," he murmured almost to himself. Nathaniel spent nearly 2 weeks replacing these floorboards, shortly before he disappeared. Eleanor looked up immediately. "These exact boards?" Thomas nodded. "Said termites had weakened them." He smiled faintly. "Never made much sense to me. They looked perfectly solid before he replaced them. Eleanor thanked him warmly after he departed. The moment his wagon disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees, she returned directly to the center of the room. Now she possessed two separate clues. Someone had carefully lifted these boards before, and Nathaniel Granger himself had supposedly replaced them only days before vanishing forever. She knelt slowly, placing the pry bar beneath the edge of the first plank. Applying gentle pressure, she eased the old board upward, just enough to loosen the aged nails, without splitting the wood. One by one, the remaining boards lifted free. Beneath them lay not ordinary earth, but a carefully constructed wooden compartment, built between the floor joists. It stretched nearly 4 feet long, and perhaps 18 inches deep. Eleanor lowered the lamp closer. The hidden space had been lined with cedar to keep moisture away. Inside rested a long rectangular tin document box wrapped carefully inside layers of oilcloth that had preserved it from dampness remarkably well. Beside the box lay an old leather satchel, several Telegraph message books tied neatly with faded blue ribbon, and a brass cylinder sealed tightly with wax. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. She carefully lifted the document box onto the floor. Though covered with dust, its lock remained surprisingly clean. There was no key attached. Looking more closely, she noticed the latch had never actually been locked. Whoever hid the box wanted it protected, but not permanently sealed. Slowly, she opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of neatly folded legal papers, survey maps, handwritten correspondence, and a single leather folder bearing one simple handwritten title across its cover. The original charter of Silver Crossing. Eleanor stared silently at the words. Even she knew enough local history to recognize their importance. Every child attending school in Silver Crossing had learned the same story. The town's original charter, the document legally establishing the settlement and guaranteeing shared ownership of certain public lands, had disappeared decades earlier. Without the original charter, countless disputes over land boundaries had remained unresolved. Some believed it had been destroyed in a courthouse fire. Others claimed traveling outlaws had stolen it while robbing county records. Historians had searched for years without success. Yet here it rested quietly, beneath the floor of an abandoned telegraph office, where no one had thought to look. Eleanor carefully opened the leather folder. The parchment inside remained beautifully preserved despite its age. Elegant signatures lined the final page together with the official territorial seal. Attached beneath the charter rested a folded letter written in careful black ink. Across the outside appeared only 6 words: "To whoever finds this at last." Eleanor gently unfolded the letter. The handwriting differed from the charter itself. The signature at the bottom caught her attention immediately. Nathaniel Granger. She drew a slow breath and began to read. The first sentence alone changed everything she believed about the abandoned telegraph office. "If you are reading this, then I failed to protect Silver Crossing myself, and the truth has waited beneath these floorboards for someone far braver than I ever managed to become." Eleanor remained seated upon the old pine floor long after finishing the first page of Nathaniel Granger's letter. The oil lamp beside her flickered softly, casting warm light across the parchment, while silence settled over the abandoned telegraph office. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the cottonwood trees, and somewhere far beyond the valley, a locomotive whistle echoed faintly across the evening sky. Yet inside the little building, time itself seemed to pause. Nathaniel's words carried neither panic nor bitterness. They carried the calm voice of a man who had accepted extraordinary responsibility long before anyone realized he was carrying it. She unfolded the remaining pages with careful hands. "For nearly 20 years, I have served as telegraph operator for Silver Crossing," the letter continued. "During that time, I witnessed something few others noticed. Messages passed across these wires that powerful men believed no ordinary operator would remember. They were mistaken. Telegraph operators hear history before history knows it has happened." Eleanor read every line slowly. Nathaniel described confidential telegrams exchanged between wealthy land companies, railroad executives, and territorial officials during the years Silver Crossing expanded into one of the busiest frontier towns in the region. At first, the messages concerned ordinary business matters. Then their tone gradually changed. Survey instructions were quietly altered. Property descriptions no longer matched official maps. Entire sections of common land originally reserved for schools, churches, public roads, and family homesteads disappeared from newer legal records. The missing town charter prevented anyone from proving the changes unlawful. Nathaniel had realized the alterations were no accident. Someone intended to erase the town's true founding agreement forever. Eleanor reached the final paragraph. The original charter survived because I removed it before dishonest hands could destroy it. I intended to deliver these papers personally to Judge Caleb Warren in Pine Bluff, but I learned too late that men had already begun watching me. If I vanish before reaching him, let whoever discovers this know that the greatest theft in Silver Crossing was never gold, cattle, or money. It was the future stolen from honest families who believed the law would protect them. Beneath this letter are the names of everyone involved. Trust only those whose loyalty belongs to truth rather than profit. Eleanor carefully lowered the pages. Beneath the letter rested another sealed packet, wrapped with faded red ribbon. Across the front, Nathaniel had written only 3 words: "Open carefully last." She resisted immediately breaking the seal. Instead, she continued examining the remaining contents of the document box. Several original survey maps lay neatly rolled together. Comparing them with one another, she immediately noticed substantial differences between the earliest boundaries and those appearing on more recent copies she had occasionally seen displayed inside the courthouse. Entire sections of public grazing land had quietly become private ranches. A broad parcel originally marked for a future public school now appeared divided among commercial warehouses. Even the railroad right-of-way had shifted several hundred yards without explanation. None of the changes appeared accidental. Every alteration benefited the same handful of powerful property owners. At the bottom of the box rested dozens of copied telegrams, each carefully dated and signed by Nathaniel. One message immediately caught Eleanor's attention: delay filing original charter until revised survey approved. Destroy earlier copy immediately. Another followed only days later. Operator must not learn contents. Confirm delivery through alternate office. Eleanor felt a chill travel slowly down her spine. Nathaniel had not merely stumbled upon corruption. He had unknowingly become part of the communication network, carrying instructions that enabled it. Once he understood what the messages truly meant, he chose to protect the original charter rather than obey those sending the orders. Looking around the quiet office, Eleanor suddenly understood why he had disappeared. He had never abandoned his post. He had defended it. Just then, hurried footsteps sounded upon the porch outside. Eleanor instinctively replaced every document inside the tin box before sliding it carefully back beneath the open floor. The loose boards remained nearby, ready to conceal everything once again. A firm knock followed. "Miss?" called a familiar voice. "It's Thomas Mercer." Eleanor opened the door. The elderly mail carrier stood holding a folded newspaper beneath one arm, his expression unusually troubled. "I thought you should see this." He handed her the paper. Printed across the front page appeared a bold announcement: Union land consolidation approved. East District properties to be transferred next month. Thomas sighed deeply. They're buying nearly every remaining parcel east of town. Eleanor looked toward the Telegraph office floor behind her. "Who are they?" "The Silver Valley Development Company." Thomas removed his hat slowly. "Owned mostly by Charles Whitcomb." Eleanor recognized the name immediately. Charles Whitcomb served as chairman of the town council, president of the local bank, and wealthiest landowner in 3 counties. Nearly every major business decision in Silver Crossing eventually passed across his desk. Thomas lowered his voice. "If Whitcomb acquires the remaining public land, there'll be almost nothing left that ordinary families can afford." Eleanor carefully folded the newspaper. Nathaniel's letter suddenly felt far less like forgotten history and far more like a warning that had never stopped being relevant. After Thomas departed, she replaced every floorboard exactly as she had found it, sweeping fresh dust lightly across the seams until the hidden compartment disappeared once more. Only then did she break the red seal upon Nathaniel's final packet. Inside rested a single handwritten page, together with a small brass telegraph key, unlike any Eleanor had ever seen. Its polished handle bore delicate engraving around the base. The letter explained its purpose. This key belonged to the first operator who served Silver Crossing when the town received its official charter. Hidden inside its hollow handle is the final proof that the charter is genuine. If the documents are ever challenged, unscrew the brass cap and remove what waits inside. I prayed no one would ever need to do so. If you have reached this page, Then that day has come. Eleanor turned the telegraph key gently within her hands. At first, it appeared perfectly ordinary. Then she noticed faint threading around the polished brass handle. Carefully twisting the upper section, she felt it loosen. Inside rested an impossibly small rolled strip of parchment, protected inside a tiny glass tube. She withdrew it with extraordinary care. Unrolling the fragile paper beneath the lamp, she discovered the original territorial authentication, bearing the governor's handwritten approval and embossed wax seal. The final legal certification, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the charter beneath her floorboards was authentic. Eleanor sat in complete silence. Nathaniel Granger had hidden not only the missing charter, but every piece of evidence required to defend it against anyone powerful enough to deny its existence. Outside, darkness settled fully across Silver Crossing. Across town, Charles Whitcomb and the directors of the Silver Valley Development Company undoubtedly believed their final land acquisitions would proceed without obstacle. They had no way of knowing that beneath the worn pine floor of a forgotten telegraph office, purchased for $5 lonely because nobody else wanted it, rested the one collection of documents capable of unraveling decades of carefully constructed deception and restoring rights that an entire community had unknowingly lost. Charles Whitcomb did not yet know the missing charter had been found, but within days Eleanor began sensing that someone had become interested in the abandoned telegraph office once again. She noticed unfamiliar riders slowing their horses whenever they passed the little building along Cottonwood Crossing Road. Well-dressed businessmen who had never before ventured into the neglected Eastern District suddenly found reasons to inspect nearby properties. Even the old telegraph poles, silent for years, seemed to stand watch over a gathering storm. Eleanor refused to let suspicion govern her actions. Each morning, she continued repairing broken shutters, replacing damaged porch boards, polishing the tarnished brass telegraph instruments, and carefully restoring the office exactly as her father would have done. Anyone watching from a distance saw nothing more than a determined woman bringing an old building back to life. That appearance became her greatest protection. The less anyone suspected she had already uncovered the truth beneath the floor, the safer Nathaniel Granger's secret remained. 3 days later, Thomas Mercer returned, carrying a bundle of old county newspapers, tied together with faded twine. "Thought these might interest you," he said as he placed them gently upon the telegraph counter. "Found them while cleaning my attic." Eleanor thanked him warmly and began carefully unfolding the brittle papers. Most contained ordinary local news: harvest festivals, railroad schedules, church socials, and election notices. But one issue published nearly 27 years earlier immediately caught her attention. Across the front page appeared a headline announcing the mysterious disappearance of telegraph operator Nathaniel Granger. The article described an extensive search lasting almost 3 weeks. Deputies questioned travelers, railroad crews, ranchers, and neighboring telegraph operators. Bloodhounds followed his scent only as far as the river crossing before losing the trail completely. No signs of violence were ever discovered. His horse remained safely inside the stable. His personal savings stayed untouched inside the office safe. Even his pocket watch rested neatly upon his desk beside unfinished telegrams. The town eventually concluded he had somehow wandered away or fallen victim to unknown misfortune while traveling alone. Yet Eleanor knew something no newspaper reporter had ever learned. Nathaniel never intended to travel anywhere. He had planned to protect the charter until someone trustworthy discovered it. Thomas noticed the thoughtful expression crossing Eleanor's face. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I never told the sheriff, because at the time it didn't seem important." Eleanor looked up. "What was it?" The old mail carrier hesitated before answering. "The evening before Nathaniel disappeared, I delivered a telegram after sunset." "To the office?" Thomas nodded slowly. He read it, then burned it immediately without saying a word. "Did you recognize the sender?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, searching his memory. Only the location. It came from Pine Bluff. Eleanor immediately remembered Judge Caleb Warren, the very man Nathaniel intended to meet, according to his letter. Did Nathaniel seem frightened? Thomas shook his head. Not frightened. He looked toward the old telegraph desk, where the brass key now gleamed once again after Eleanor's careful polishing. Resolved. Those single words settled deeply within her thoughts. After Thomas departed, Eleanor retrieved the document box once more and searched through every copied telegram Nathaniel had preserved. Near the bottom, she discovered one message unlike all the others. It bore no sender's name, only a routing code from Pine Bluff. The final line read simply, "Trust no courier after Thursday. They know about the charter." Eleanor stared silently at the message. Nathaniel had received a warning. Someone inside the legal system had attempted to protect him, yet the warning had arrived too late. As evening approached, Eleanor decided she could no longer guard the truth entirely alone. Nathaniel himself had written that honest people still existed if one looked carefully enough. She needed to find them before the wrong people discovered what lay beneath the floorboards. The following morning, she traveled into Silver Crossing, carrying only copies of several survey maps hidden inside her satchel, while leaving every original safely concealed beneath the telegraph office floor. Her destination was the small historical reading room located behind the public library. Few residents visited it anymore, except school children completing assignments and elderly volunteers preserving town records. Its curator, Margaret Dawson, had spent nearly 30 years organizing dusty archives that most people considered worthless. Margaret greeted Eleanor with warm curiosity. "You're the woman who bought the old telegraph office, aren't you?" Eleanor smiled politely. "I am. You're becoming something of a mystery around town. Perhaps the building deserves more mystery than I do." Margaret laughed softly before leading Eleanor towards several tall oak cabinets filled with bound record books. "What are you looking for?" Eleanor carefully unfolded one copied survey map. "Anything about the original charter of Silver Crossing?" Margaret's smile disappeared almost instantly. "That's an unusual request." She unlocked a cabinet seldom opened and withdrew several oversized ledgers. Historians have searched for that charter for decades. Together, they spent hours comparing maps, property records, and early settlement documents. Margaret quickly noticed what Eleanor had already discovered. Boundaries appearing on older surveys differed dramatically from those recognized by current county records. Public grazing fields vanished without explanation. School land became commercial property. River access, once guaranteed to every family, quietly shifted into private ownership. Margaret leaned back in astonishment. These changes should never have been legally possible. Eleanor spoke carefully. What if the original charter still existed? Margaret looked directly into her eyes. If it did, she paused thoughtfully, it could overturn half the property disputes in this county. Before Eleanor could respond, heavy footsteps echoed across the library floor. Charles Whitcomb himself entered the reading room accompanied by his attorney. Both men greeted Margaret pleasantly before noticing Eleanor standing beside the archive table. Whitcomb removed his gloves with practiced courtesy. "Miss Brooks," he said warmly, "I understand you've taken quite an interest in local history." Eleanor met his calm gaze. "Old towns deserve remembering." Whitcomb smiled. "Sometimes the past creates unnecessary complications." His eyes briefly settled upon the survey maps spread across the table. "One must be careful not to mistake outdated records for useful ones." Margaret quietly closed the ledgers without comment. Whitcomb tipped his hat politely before departing as smoothly as he had arrived. Yet the brief encounter left the room strangely colder than before. Margaret waited until the footsteps faded completely. Then she spoke almost in a whisper. "He never visits this archive." Eleanor slowly folded the copied maps. Until today, Margaret looked toward the library entrance, deep concern replacing her earlier curiosity. "Miss Brooks, what exactly have you found inside that telegraph office?" Eleanor remained silent for several moments before answering honestly. Enough to make very powerful people nervous. Margaret did not ask another question. Instead, she quietly locked the archive cabinets once more before turning back toward Eleanor. "Then whatever you've discovered," she said firmly, "you must not face it alone." Outside, Charles Whitcomb climbed into his waiting carriage without looking back toward the library windows. But Eleanor noticed something else. Parked across the street stood another rider she had never seen before. The man wasn't watching the library, he was watching her, and when their eyes briefly met, he immediately turned his horse and rode east, directly toward the abandoned telegraph office. Margaret Dawson insisted on accompanying Eleanor back to the abandoned telegraph office that very afternoon, but Eleanor gently declined. "If too many people begin visiting the building," she explained, Whoever is watching will know something important has been found. Margaret reluctantly agreed. Before they parted, she unlocked one final cabinet inside the archive and removed a small leather notebook filled with carefully copied county records. "Take this," she said quietly. "These are my personal notes. I've spent 20 years documenting changes that never made sense. Perhaps they'll help connect whatever you've already discovered." Eleanor thanked her sincerely before slipping the notebook into her satchel. She left the library by the rear entrance, hoping to avoid unwanted attention, yet as she crossed the narrow alley, she noticed fresh horse tracks leading toward Cottonwood Crossing Road. The mysterious rider had indeed traveled east. He knew exactly where she lived now. By the time Eleanor reached the telegraph office, evening sunlight had begun stretching long golden shadows across the meadow. At first, everything appeared unchanged. The weathered porch remained quiet. The cottonwood trees whispered softly above the roof. Birds continued nesting beneath the eaves, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet the moment she climbed the front steps, she noticed something that immediately tightened every instinct her father had ever taught her to trust. The front door stood slightly open, only an inch, barely enough for someone leaving in haste. Eleanor distinctly remembered locking it before departing that morning. She paused, listening. Silence answered from inside. Slowly she pushed the door wider. The little office appeared almost exactly as she had left it. Chairs remained neatly arranged. The brass telegraph key rested upon the oak desk. The cast-iron stove sat cold beside the wall. Yet careful eyes noticed what hurried eyes would miss. One drawer beneath the message counter had been opened and closed again, without fully aligning. Dust upon the windowsill had been disturbed by fresh fingerprints. A chair stood several inches farther from the desk than before. Someone had entered, and someone had searched. Eleanor immediately walked toward the center of the room, where the concealed compartment rested beneath the pine floor. She knelt quietly, studying the narrow seams between the boards. Relief washed gently across her face. The dust she had scattered across the joints remained almost undisturbed. Whoever searched the office had never discovered the hidden compartment. They had looked everywhere except beneath their feet. She carefully replaced several scattered objects exactly where they belonged, before sitting silently at the old telegraph desk. Nathaniel Granger's warning echoed once again through her thoughts. Trust only those whose loyalty belongs to truth rather than profit. Whoever had entered the office already suspected valuable documents existed. It would only be a matter of time before they returned better prepared. Just as twilight settled across the valley, another knock sounded upon the front door. Eleanor opened it cautiously, to find Thomas Mercer standing beside his wagon, breathing harder than usual. "I came as quickly as I could," he said. "Charles Whitcomb called a special meeting tomorrow night." Eleanor frowned. For what purpose? Thomas handed her an official notice bearing the town seal. Emergency council session regarding unsafe structures in the East District. Eleanor scanned the brief announcement. The abandoned telegraph office appeared first on the list, scheduled for immediate condemnation and demolition due to alleged public safety concerns. Thomas watched her expression carefully. "That building has stood untouched for nearly 25 years, he said quietly. "Funny how it suddenly became dangerous only after someone bought it." Eleanor folded the notice without speaking. She understood exactly what the meeting truly meant. If the office disappeared, so would every secret hidden beneath its floor. After Thomas departed, she retrieved the tin document box from the concealed compartment and carried it upstairs into the tiny attic storage loft above the office ceiling. Beneath loose roof planks, she discovered a narrow cavity between two heavy rafters, where the box fit almost perfectly. If anyone tore up the floor tomorrow, they would find nothing. The evidence would survive elsewhere. Before climbing down, she looked across the quiet meadow through the small attic window. A rider stood far beyond the fence line, watching the building from the top of a distant hill. Even at that distance, she recognized Charles Whitcomb's distinctive black carriage waiting nearby. They had not come to admire the sunset. They were waiting. The following evening, nearly every resident of Silver Crossing crowded into the town hall. News that the beloved old telegraph office faced demolition had spread more quickly than anyone expected. Elderly railroad workers who had once relied upon the office arrived early. Merchants closed their shops before sunset. Families filled every available bench, while others stood quietly along the walls. Charles Whitcomb opened the meeting with calm confidence. The East District contains several abandoned structures, creating unnecessary danger, he announced. The telegraph office, in particular, has become unstable and should be removed before injury occurs. Several council members nodded without question. Then Whitcomb added almost casually, following demolition, the property may be incorporated into the Silver Valley development expansion. Before anyone could call for a vote, Eleanor slowly rose from her seat near the back of the room. Every conversation ceased. She walked toward the front, carrying only Margaret's notebook beneath one arm. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said politely, "when was the last official structural inspection performed on the telegraph office?" Whitcomb hesitated, almost imperceptibly. "Our engineering committee reviewed the matter." Eleanor remained calm. "May I see the report?" Silence settled across the hall. Whitcomb glanced briefly toward his attorney. No report appeared. Eleanor continued gently, "Because I've spent the past week replacing damaged beams and inspecting every foundation support myself. The building is considerably stronger than many newer structures standing in town today." Murmurs spread throughout the crowded room. Several former railroad workers nodded quietly. One elderly carpenter stood unexpectedly. "She's right," he called from the back. "That office was built from old-growth pine. Strongest timber ever brought through this valley." Another voice followed. "My father helped raise those walls." Soon others added their memories. "I delivered telegrams there. My brother worked the wires. That's where we learned our son came home safely." Whitcomb realized too late that the forgotten building no longer belonged only to history. It belonged to living memory. Yet Eleanor knew this meeting was only the beginning. The true battle would not be fought over old timber or weathered walls. It would be fought over the truth, hidden inside a missing charter that powerful men believed had vanished forever. And for the first time since Nathaniel Granger disappeared nearly 3 decades earlier, that truth finally had someone willing to protect it until the very end. The morning after the council meeting, Silver Crossing awakened beneath clear blue skies, yet the usual peace that settled over the frontier town seemed strangely absent. Conversations paused whenever Charles Whitcomb passed along the boardwalk. Shopkeepers lowered their voices as neighbors quietly discussed the young woman living inside the abandoned telegraph office. Some believed she had simply delayed its demolition for another few days. Others sensed something much larger had begun unfolding beneath the surface. Eleanor rose before sunrise, as she always had. She swept the front porch, polished the brass telegraph key until it reflected the first rays of morning light, and brewed a small pot of coffee over the cast-iron stove. Outwardly, nothing about her routine suggested urgency. Inwardly, she knew every passing hour mattered. The original charter remained hidden safely above the ceiling beams, but she also understood Nathaniel Granger had never intended those documents to remain hidden forever. They were meant to be brought into the light when the right moment finally arrived. Shortly after breakfast, a wagon rolled quietly into the meadow. Margaret Dawson stepped down carrying a leather portfolio, followed by Thomas Mercer and an elderly gentleman, Eleanor, immediately recognized from the courthouse records. Judge Henry Calloway, recently retired from the Territorial Circuit Court, walked slowly with the assistance of an oak cane, his sharp grey eyes revealing that age had diminished neither his memory nor his judgment. Eleanor welcomed them inside. Without unnecessary words, she climbed into the attic, removed the hidden document box, and carefully placed it upon the old telegraph desk. No one spoke as she lifted the lid. Judge Calloway adjusted his spectacles before unfolding the original town charter. He examined every page slowly, comparing signatures, seals, dates, and paper stock with the practiced care of a man who had spent 40 years weighing evidence. Nearly half an hour passed before he finally looked up. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "if these documents are authentic—" He paused only briefly. "Then Silver Crossing has been living under fraudulent land records for almost 30 years. Margaret carefully spread Nathaniel Granger's survey maps across the desk. Thomas added the copied telegrams. Judge Calloway compared each piece with remarkable patience until the story became unmistakably clear. The original charter reserved thousands of acres surrounding Silver Crossing for permanent public use: school grounds, grazing commons, river access, churches, parks, and affordable homesteads for future settlers. After Nathaniel concealed the charter, revised surveys quietly erased those protections. Private companies acquired the land legally only because the original charter had disappeared. Judge Calloway removed his spectacles and sighed deeply. Someone didn't merely steal land. His voice carried profound sadness. They stole opportunities from generations who never realized those opportunities belonged to them. Eleanor then produced the tiny glass tube hidden inside the brass telegraph key. Judge Calloway carefully unrolled the governor's original territorial certification. His expression changed immediately. "This settles everything." He looked toward Eleanor. No court in this territory could ignore this evidence. Margaret smiled for the first time all morning. "Then we finally have enough." "Yes," the judge replied, "but we must move before anyone attempts to make these documents disappear again." By noon, official petitions requesting an emergency county hearing had already been prepared. Judge Calloway personally signed the filing, attaching his own legal opinion affirming the authenticity of every recovered document. A mounted courier departed immediately for the county courthouse in Pine Bluff, carrying certified copies, while the originals remained safely inside the telegraph office. News traveled astonishingly fast. Before sunset, Charles Whitcomb received word that a judicial review had been scheduled. Within the hour, he arrived outside the telegraph office, accompanied by his attorney and 2 deputies. Eleanor stepped onto the porch before they could knock. Whitcomb removed his hat politely, though the strain beneath his calm expression had become impossible to hide. "Miss Brooks," he began, "I've heard troubling rumors." Eleanor answered calmly. "Rumors often disappear once truth arrives." Whitcomb forced a faint smile. "If certain historical documents have surfaced, I'd be willing to purchase them." Eleanor remained silent. He continued, "Name your price." She looked directly into his eyes. They were never mine to sell. His smile vanished. "Do you understand how much disruption those papers could cause?" "I understand exactly how much peace their disappearance has already cost." For several long moments neither spoke. Finally, Whitcomb quietly placed his hat back upon his head. "You are making powerful enemies." Eleanor answered with complete calm. Nathaniel Granger already knew that. Whitcomb's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his carriage. 3 days later, the Pine Bluff courthouse filled beyond capacity. Farmers, merchants, railroad workers, teachers, ministers, and families from across the county crowded every available seat. Many had traveled through the night after hearing the missing charter had finally been found. Judge Henry Calloway presented the recovered documents with quiet precision. Margaret Dawson explained the altered survey maps. Thomas Mercer testified regarding Nathaniel Granger's disappearance and the mysterious telegram warning him not to trust any courier. Finally, Eleanor stepped forward, carrying the brass telegraph key. She carefully unscrewed the handle and presented the tiny glass tube containing the governor's original certification. The courtroom became perfectly silent. After examining every document personally, the presiding county judge slowly rose from the bench. "The evidence before this court leaves no reasonable doubt." His voice echoed across the crowded chamber. "The original charter of Silver Crossing has been recovered intact. Every subsequent survey contradicting its provisions is hereby declared legally invalid, pending full review." Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge continued, "Public lands reserved by the founding charter shall immediately return to community ownership under the protection originally intended by the territorial government." No cheering followed. The moment felt too important for celebration. Instead, people quietly reached for one another's hands. Elderly men who had spent decades believing their parents had simply lost disputed property now understood the truth. Young families realized new homesteads would finally become available. Teachers learned land, reserved for a permanent school, still belonged to the children of Silver Crossing. River access reopened. Public grazing lands returned. The town had not gained a fortune. It had regained its future. Charles Whitcomb faced no dramatic arrest. The principal architects of the original deception had died many years earlier. Yet the judgment stripped away the legal foundation supporting much of his vast land empire. Within months he resigned from the town council, sold large portions of his remaining holdings, and quietly left Silver Crossing. No angry crowds followed him. His punishment came through something far heavier than public humiliation. He spent the rest of his life watching the town prosper from land he had once believed belonged only to men like himself. That spring, volunteers arrived daily at the abandoned telegraph office. Carpenters repaired the roof. Railroad workers restored the front porch. Children polished old brass telegraph instruments, while former operators carefully restrung decorative telegraph wire between the weathered poles outside. What had once been a forgotten building became the Silver Crossing Community Telegraph Museum and Meeting Hall, preserving not only frontier communication, but the story of Nathaniel Granger's courage and Eleanor Brooks's quiet determination. When the restoration was complete, the original town charter was placed inside a specially crafted glass display beneath the very floor where it had rested unseen for nearly 3 decades. Beside it stood the little brass telegraph key, with its hidden compartment left open for every visitor to see. A simple plaque carried Nathaniel's own words. The greatest theft was never land, it was the future stolen from honest families. Eleanor never accepted ownership of the telegraph office beyond the modest deed she had purchased for $5 lonely. Instead, she transferred the building itself to the people of Silver Crossing, believing some places achieved their greatest purpose only when they belonged to everyone. Every evening, as golden sunlight settled across the cottonwood trees and the old telegraph wires hummed softly in the prairie breeze, visitors gathered on the porch, sharing stories, laughter, and memories. The abandoned office that no one had wanted became the heart of the community once again, proving that forgotten places sometimes preserve the most important messages of all, not inside the wires that once carried them, but beneath the floor, where faithful hands quietly protected the truth until the right person finally came home.